You're just after his money, aren't you? Typical of the lower class. Everyone who gets close to Chris has always been like that. I felt sympathy for Chris not being able to tell me everything about his family because of his parents. Like this. Then, without waiting for my response, Emily also said, "I'd like to see what their parents look like. What do they eat to become so rude?" I clenched my fists, trying to control my shaking body filled with anger, but it was no use. "Then I'll call my parents right now." I shouted, and Chris's family looked shocked for a moment. I was furious at these three people who looked down on everyone important to me. Later, I received news that my parents had arrived. "Hello, the parents from the lower class, as you called us," my father said. "We were called by our daughter, so here we are." Chris's parents froze upon seeing mine, and eventually they ended up showing an embarrassing display of behavior. My name is Anna Turner, a 40-year-old working from home. I used to be a designer at a company, but now I am a freelance designer. I met Chris, my fiancé, who was 7 years younger than me, through work. After becoming a freelancer at first, it was just a professional relationship. Even when we went out for drinks for business, nothing significant happened. But as we spent more time together, we gradually developed a liking for each other. Our relationship evolved from professional to friendly, and eventually we started dating about a year after we met. Half a year later, since we were dating with the intention of marrying and considering our ages, me being 40 and Chris being 33, we decided to move in together and got engaged. I had doubts about our relationship because of my age and thought about breaking up. But every time Chris reassured me, saying, "I want to marry you because I love you, Anna, not because of your age." Our marriage wasn't about age. I felt that it wasn't a decision made lightly. Chris cared for me deeply, and during our time living together, we had constructive conflicts that helped us understand each other better. 2 months after moving in together, we thought it was time to start visiting our parents to discuss our marriage. First, we planned to visit my parents' house. Chris, usually casual, dressed up in a new suit for the occasion. How should I greet Anna's parents? Is my hair okay? Does my suit look all right? I knew my parents wouldn't judge him by his appearance, but I didn't want to dampen his spirit since he prepared so much for them. "Don't worry, you look great, and you're always charming," I told Chris. He blushed at my words. I never imagined marrying someone 7 years younger than me. Holding hands with Chris, we walked towards the house. My parents welcomed Chris warmly, sensing his discomfort in the suit. They said, "Next time, come in casual clothes, and we'll go for some good ramen noodles." Chris blushed at their invitation, but what made me happiest was hearing him say how nice my parents were. As we were leaving, however, our happy mood was soon disrupted by an unexpected encounter. While stopping at a supermarket, a woman we didn't know rushed over, exclaiming, "Oh, Chris!" She looked about my age. Chris, though clearly uncomfortable, responded to her, and for a moment I suspected infidelity. But that wasn't the case. It turned out she was Chris's sister, Emily. Emily, who had lived far away after getting married recently, got divorced and had just returned to her parents' home. Laughing as she told us, Emily was inappropriately close to Chris. Chris kept saying, "Stop it. We're not kids anymore. It's embarrassing in public, and besides, we're 33 and 41 now." But she didn't care. Then, Emily finally noticed me standing out of the conversation and gave me a look over that felt like a judgment. It was extremely uncomfortable, as if I was being appraised. "What? This woman? She looks about my age. Is she your girlfriend?" "Oh, I can't believe someone like her could become part of our family," she said, laughing disdainfully. I was infuriated by her words and couldn't help but retort, "It's rude to say something like that when we've just met, don't you think?" Sparks flew between me and Emily. "Hey, stop it. I'm sorry, Anna. My sister is always like this." Chris tried to intervene, but Emily just kept smirking condescendingly. She continued to follow us around the store, throwing things she wanted into our shopping basket without care. Chris told her to pay for her own stuff, but she said she had no money and insisted that we buy it for her. We returned the items she added and thought we had gotten rid of her. However, ultimately, during checkout, she insisted we buy her alcohol too. I was supposed to pay for the shopping today, but given Emily's behavior, Chris opened his wallet. Chris sighed as he paid, and Emily walked out with her alcohol without a word of thanks. Like a storm, Emily seemed satisfied, clutching her bottle and heading home. Chris apologized to me, his brows furrowed. "Sorry, my sister has always been like that." I've had quite a tough time dealing with her. I assured Chris it was okay. This incident was all due to Emily's pushiness, and there was no need for Chris to apologize. Although it felt unpleasant to be looked down upon, what others think of me varies. I decided not to let it bother me and returned to the apartment with Chris. But the next day, an incident occurred. I was rudely awakened by a loud noise early in the morning. It was Sunday, a day when both Chris and I had turned off our alarms. Wondering what it could be, I saw that Chris's phone screen showed a call from Sister. Chris, also startled awake, frowned upon seeing the screen. It was clear that he really didn't want to answer the phone. Reluctantly, he answered the call, and Emily's shrill voice was so loud I could hear her, even though it wasn't on speaker. "That rum walking in the same direction must be your fiancé, right? Then bring her over for greetings right away. It's proper manners. If she's going to be part of the Omar family, she should come right now." Apparently, Emily had told their parents about me, and now they were demanding that I visit their home today with Chris. Emily, I don't have a dress for the visit," I said. "Oh, that's fine," Emily said before hanging up the phone. Chris sighed and put down his smartphone, saying, "Don't worry about it. I'll talk to my sister and our parents so you don't fret about it." However, I worried that ignoring the situation might leave a bad impression. "No, it's okay. I can get ready quickly," I said, rushing to buy a cake from a nearby renowned bakery and choosing the simplest but prettiest outfit I had recently purchased. Then, pulling a reluctant Chris, we headed to his family's home. But I deeply regretted rushing there today. Upon arrival, we were greeted by a large front gate. Passing through, we saw a stone arrangement combining various natural stones and pillars introduced to the plantation era. In the garden's pond, koi fish elegantly swam, waving their tails. Beyond the splendid English-style garden stood a traditional plantation house. Turning to Chris, he looked a bit guilty and said, "I didn't hide it on purpose, but people are usually surprised when I talk about my family home, so I was going to tell you, but sorry it's only now," he apologized, scratching his cheek. Chris had been apologizing since yesterday. I decided to let it go, understanding that he must have had his reasons for keeping it a secret. We were then led to a very large living room. Famous paintings adorned the shelves, along with decorative pieces I had seen in books. Seated in the center of the room on a sofa was my mother-in-law, elegantly dressed in an expensive dress, her hair neatly done. My father-in-law sat with an aura of authority, and Emily, in contrast, gave off a frivolous vibe. When I started to speak, my mother-in-law sharply said, "Who gave you permission to speak?" I froze. Chris immediately protested, but it was ignored. After introducing myself and handing out the cakes and pastries, Emily scoffed, "A regular bakery? We don't acknowledge anything but high-end stores," and unbelievably threw them in the trash. I was speechless at the scene. When my father-in-law finally spoke, it dealt me further damage. "You're after the money, aren't you?" just a low life. As I reeled from the shocking statement, my mother-in-law also sneered, unleashing another condescending remark. Every girl who approaches Chris is like that, really. They have no sense of their place. It's so unbecoming for poor people to approach the wealthy like this. Her scornful smile was like that of a villainous queen. I felt sympathy for Chris, realizing he couldn't tell me everything about his family because of them. Before I could respond, Emily added, "I'd like to see what your parents look like." I was so infuriated that I couldn't hold back any longer. Despite trying to keep my cool, I eventually lost my temper. "Then I'll call my parents right now," I shouted. Emily briefly showed surprise, but quickly returned to taunting, telling me to go ahead and try. "Anna, calm down." I felt sorry for Chris, caught in the middle, but I was boiling with anger. Not just for myself, but also for my dear parents being looked down upon as they wished. I contacted my parents, who initially thought I was playing a prank and laughed. But as I spoke through tears and sobs, asking them to come, my father, with a serious tone, said, "Understood, something serious must have happened to make you cry like this." "Wait a bit, we're on our way." As I was about to give him directions, he gently said, "No need, I know where it is," and hung up the phone. Before I could ponder how he knew, the in-laws started talking again. "The poor family, I wonder what they'll wear. Surely not some mass-produced outfit that costs just $40 each. Of course, it's cheap stuff. That's all poor people can afford. Really, being poor is a sin itself. You think so too, right?" I didn't respond to that question. I regained my composure after talking with my father and was just waiting for the right moment to strike back. The in-laws didn't care at all about my demeanor. The in-laws, including Chris's father, nodded in agreement with the two women's words, starting to badmouth me and my family. It wasn't just hard for me to endure. Chris seemed to struggle too. "Please stop. Why can you say such shameful things?" Chris repeatedly tried to reason with them, but they didn't listen. I thought if they were wealthy, they would cherish their eldest son. But then my eyes caught a photo on the shelf, confirming how they treated Chris. It was a family photo with a man who looked a bit older than Chris, smiling. That man must be the family's eldest son, and Chris being the second son, Chris was negged because his parents, proud of their wealth, didn't care for someone like me near Chris. The darkness Chris had to endure in his family must have been significant. That's why he looked so distressed. My heart ached, and I felt tears welling up again. I was so angry at these three people who looked down on everyone important to me. I couldn't hold back anymore. Soon after, a servant came in to report that my parents had arrived, and then the three of them were taken aback by the sight of my parents. Ultimately, ending up in an embarrassing display just minutes later, my parents were ushered into the room. In unison, they said, with big smiles, "Hello, we're the so-called lower-class parents. The poor family, I wonder what they'll wear. Surely not some mass-produced outfit that costs just $40 each. Of course, it's cheap stuff. That's all poor people can afford. Really, being poor is a sin itself. You think so too, right?" I didn't respond to that question. I regained my composure after talking with my father and was just waiting for the right moment to strike back. The in-laws didn't care at all about my demeanor. The in-laws, including Chris's father, nodded in agreement with the two women's words, starting to badmouth me and my family. It wasn't just hard for me to endure. Chris seemed to struggle too. "Please stop. Why can you say such shameful things?" Chris repeatedly tried to reason with them, but they didn't listen. I thought if they were wealthy, they would cherish their eldest son. But then my eyes caught a photo on the shelf, confirming how they treated Chris. It was a family photo with a man who looked a bit older than Chris, smiling. That man must be the family's eldest son, and Chris being the second son, Chris was negged because his parents, proud of their wealth, didn't care for someone like me near Chris. The darkness Chris had to endure in his family must have been significant. That's why he looked so distressed. My heart ached, and I felt tears welling up again. I was so angry at these three people who looked down on everyone important to me. I couldn't hold back anymore. Soon after, a servant came in to report that my parents had arrived, and then the three of them were taken aback by the sight of my parents. Ultimately, ending up in an embarrassing display just minutes later, my parents were ushered into the room. In unison, they said, with big smiles, "Hello, we're the so-called lower-class parents. We've been called by our daughter, so here we are." Their appearance was far from what one would call lower class. They were dressed impressively. The in-laws froze upon seeing my parents, and they eventually made a disgraceful scene. My father wore a clearly expensive suit, and my mother donned a formal dress with a refined silhouette. While I was somewhat reassured by their appearance and the effort they made to get here so quickly, the bewildered in-laws exchanged glances, saying, "What? Wait, what's going on here? These two can't be serious. They always dress like this, that's something else." Surprised by the sight, Emily and the in-laws, who had been talkative until now, were at a loss for words. Chris's father, trying to save face, made comments, but was clearly shaken. Meanwhile, my parents were all smiles, but their eyes weren't laughing. They seemed calm, yet their anger was palpable. Seeing my parents in this state, I decided to ask them pointedly, "Was there some kind of gathering today?" I asked, and my mom nodded. It wasn't just our glamorous outfits that caught the attention. The mention of the gathering seemed to intrigue my in-laws, who waited eagerly for our explanation. Everyone, including Chris, seemed confused, so I decided to explain everything slowly and clearly. Actually, ever since we arrived at this house, I had a hunch of that housing area and got in through connections. That's not the level we're talking about, right? He still wasn't ready to change his condescending attitude. It seemed he had no choice but to keep on the offensive in this no-win situation. So he decided to take on a losing battle. Watching my father-in-law's ridiculous display, my anger began to fade. Competing with such low-level people seemed pointless. So I deliberately asked my dad in a loud voice, "Speaking of which, Dad, you knew this address before I even told you." "How come?" Ignoring the bewildered look on my father-in-law's face, my dad laughed and said, "Well, that's because our family built this magnificent house and created this stunning English-style garden." At that, my father-in-law leaped to his feet, his eyes bulging in anger. "Are you insulting our home?" His flushed face made it clear that this impressive estate and garden were the embodiment of his pride. He seemed to have a deep emotional attachment to this house. Emily quickly retorted, "This house isn't something any random carpenter could build, you know. And now you're saying your unknown family built it." Ha! Give me a break with that joke. According to her, this house and garden were crafted by top-notch artisans, far beyond the capabilities of ordinary workers. My parents' lively rebuttal led Emily to laugh mockingly. This kind of bluffing is exactly what proves you're from the bottom of the barrel. It was like watching fish thrive in water. Appalled, my parents and I didn't know how to react. Then suddenly, Chris, who had been silent, spoke up. "I visited Anna's family home the other day. That's when I realized they were no ordinary people. Unlike Dad and his parents, who just inherited wealth and boast about being rich, Anna's family are the real deal, wealthy people." This statement infuriated his father, who approached Chris menacingly. But I quickly stepped in to protect him. Unable to do anything, his father, frustrated, went back to the sofa, grinding his teeth. Chris, concerned, asked me, "Are you okay? Don't push yourself too hard." "Thanks for worrying, but you know I'm the older one here, so lean on me," I joked, causing Chris to blush and softly thank me. This moment of courage displayed by Chris greatly impressed my parents. Her mother, who had been silently observing, initiated the conversation. "I'm glad to see the koi we raised are swimming so energetically. Is that kind old gardener taking care of them?" Emily and Chris's mother were dumbfounded by this comment. Chris's father, trying to maintain his pride, scoffed. "Those koi were purchased from a renowned koi farm in Japan, introduced to us by the craftsman who built this place. So I have no recollection of receiving them from you," he trailed off. As my mother presented her business card, leaving him speechless, his wife and Emily inquired what was going on. Chris's father, stammering, answered, "The owner of the koi farm." His face was pale. My mother casually replied, "Our family has been running a 100-year-old koi farm, along with an apparel brand and other businesses related to weddings and funerals. My father joined in, 'We've been carpenters for generations. My wife's family and ours have been close, which is how we met. By the way, you mentioned earlier that the famous koi farm was introduced by the craftsman who built this place, right? That would mean you already know that our family built this house and garden. We also have expertise in traditional European architecture and garden design. Our master, the previous generation, was the one who built this house and garden." It was as if the two of them started talking in a casual, light-hearted manner, almost like they were just making small talk. Chris's family was stunned by them. Chris, sighing, continued, "When I visited Anna's home, I sensed an indescribable aura from her parents. It made me painfully aware of how petty our family's character is, especially Emily's childish behavior. Despite being only a year apart in age, the difference between her and Anna is astonishing." They are probably referring to the incident that happened at the supermarket. Emily, red-faced with anger, was rebuked by her trembling mother. The difference in character, not wealth, had become apparent. From that day, Chris's family no longer had any complaints against us. A few days later, Chris's phone rang again. It was Emily who surprisingly wanted to meet the three of us. She claimed she wanted to apologize for her past behavior. Despite her seemingly downcast voice, we decided to meet her at the diner. There was Emily with a somber expression. As soon as Chris and I sat down, Emily clasped her hands together with a loud clap and unexpectedly made a request. "I'm truly sorry about the other day, but could you possibly lend me a little over $20,000? Directing her request at me instead of Chris, her brazenness and selfishness left me with a mix of incredulity and anger. "That's rude. You said you wanted to apologize, so we made time to come here, and now this—" Chris exploded in anger. Emily, ignoring Chris, kept begging me for money, pleading that it was a matter of life or death. When pressed for a reason, she was evasive. It was clear that there was no point in listening further. I got up to leave, saying, "Is that all you wanted?" I'm appalled. "I don't have a single dime to lend you." "Goodbye, Emily." Pale-faced, Emily finally began to explain her situation after seeing us about to leave. She confessed she needed the money urgently for alimony, as her ex-husband demanded it following their divorce. "I cheated, got caught, and now this," she admitted. Clearly, it was a case of reaping what one has sown. According to the story, Emily's child, who appears to be a middle school student, declared a desire to live with the father rather than a mother involved in infidelity. Consequently, Emily hastily agreed to the divorce and readily relinquished custody to her ex-husband. Initially, it seemed okay, but then her ex-husband contacted her, demanding alimony and a third of the child's support until high school. The content was such that she needed to pay immediately, an alimony of $2,000 for her infidelity and one-third of the estimated amount for child support until high school graduation. If it was for an illness or some urgent need, I might have considered it. But it's your responsibility to pay for your own affairs, I stated bluntly. Emily looked crushed by my words. Regardless, I continued, after all, you were the one who cheated. Paying alimony and child support is your obligation. Please manage it yourself. I can't. That's why I'm asking you. Emily revealed that she had quit her job to move back and had no savings. I was even more dumbfounded, at a loss for words. She had initially asked her parents for help, but they refused, calling it dirty money for infidelity. Realizing that my family was wealthy, Emily seemed to have posed such a lie to call me out, seeing me as her last resort, which started to boil my anger again. Feeling increasingly frustrated and speechless, I was about to retort when Chris suddenly slammed the table and stood up, shouting at Emily in a way I'd never seen before. Enough, Emily. Why do you always rely on others only when it's convenient for you? I still vividly remember how you treated me as if I was nothing to you, always favoring our wealthy father and eldest brother. Don't interfere with my life anymore. I finally found my happiness. The other customers stared as I apologized for the commotion, and Chris regained his composure, glaring at Emily. I may be your brother, but to Anna, you're a stranger. If we marry, she becomes my wife. Anyone who treats my wife like this is neither a sister nor family, Chris spoke decisively. At his words, whether out of anger or shame, Emily's face turned bright red. Chris declared he was cutting ties with the family. Then, taking my hand, he said, "You don't have to listen to her. What she says isn't worth your time," and led me out of the store. That moment when Chris stood up for me so clearly made me fall for him all over again. I wanted to be there for Chris too, and swore to myself that someday I would settle things with those rude in-laws. But at the same time, I was troubled by something. After all, adults don't need their parents' permission to get married. It seems wrong to oppose a child's marriage just because the parents don't like it or find it annoying. However, I couldn't help but worry about Chris and his family. Would Chris be okay if we got married despite their opposition? While I was grappling with these worries, Chris smiled gently and said, "It's okay. Don't worry about anything. I'm going to build a new family with you." Then 3 months after that day, we got married and became husband and wife. Soon after, our in-laws, having sniffed out the news, showed up at our apartment, begging for money. I thought they had plenty of money, but then it came out that Emily had done something outrageous. Desperate for money and unemployed, she couldn't borrow the $20,000 she needed from consumer finance. Instead of working to earn money and build credit, her thinking went off the rails, and she apparently got involved in a special fraud scheme, tricking an elderly woman in her 80s into transferring $200,000. Having gotten the money, Emily arranged a lavish overseas trip. Before she could pay any compensation, all for the sake of her own luxury, she bought a ton of stuff on the trip and was arrested by the police when she returned. In a short time, she had spent more than half of the swindled money, and the victim's family was pushing for a full-blown lawsuit. She had repaid the $200,000, but because of the severity of the crime, she was now facing criminal charges. That's why she wasn't here. We could lose everything, our entire fortune, because of this mess. Please help us, the in-laws pleaded. It was clear that the company's reputation was extremely important, especially since they were already struggling with poor business performance. They had recently downsized from 10 employees to just one elderly man, and the garden was barely maintained. Add their daughter's scandal to the mix, and it was chaos. Employees were leaving thinking the company wouldn't last, and they were desperate. "You're my dear son. That means I'm your dear father, right? You're going to help me, aren't you?" Chris's dad had the gall to say. His mom, who had always looked down on Chris for being the second son, was now awkwardly smiling, saying, "I gave birth to you and raised you. You owe us that much." But Chris said, "I've married into Anna's family. My name is now Chris Turner. I've cut off my ties with you, and Anna is not your daughter-in-law, so don't ever bother us again." Seeing their plans thwarted, the in-laws turned to me, sweating profusely. "You're just showing off with your parents' money. Can't you at least use a little of that to help your in-laws out?" I wasn't sure what to do, but then I just snorted and pointed to a flyer on the table. It was about a new high-rise condominium that had just started selling units. My in-laws looked puzzled, so I declared loudly, "I bought the top-floor corner unit in that high-rise." This left my in-laws speechless and shocked. They had always called me poor and lowly, but here I was, an independent freelancer designer earning well over $200,000 a year. I had already decided to buy the condo, while Chris was going to buy a car. Hearing this for the first time, my in-laws were frozen in surprise, exchanging glances. People who really have money don't brag about it. That's just tacky. At that, my in-laws just collapsed on the spot, faces twisted in frustration. Finally settling matters with our adversaries, I looked at Chris with a feeling of refreshing closure. He was also celebrating with a fist pump. Later, I heard that Emily was sentenced to prison for her involvement in the special fraud scheme. Naturally, the aftermath fell on my in-laws. Their daughter's scandal led to the rapid decline of their company, and they eventually had to sell their once prized house. Now they're living modestly in a small apartment, barely getting by. After the company effectively dissolved, I heard rumors that its name had changed and new residents had moved into their old house. Chris told me it was his much older brother who had bought out their father's company in the house. I had wondered why the eldest son hadn't helped them, but it turned out he had his own struggles and had left the Omar family. The in-laws were complaining about their eldest son being ungrateful, but those words didn't seem to affect him in the slightest. They had neglected their second son, Chris, and us, only to be thoroughly defeated. Their eldest daughter destroyed their house, and finally, everything was taken by the eldest son. I heard they had been quite harsh to his wife, so I'm sure the eldest son and his wife are satisfied with this outcome. For me, it was satisfying and amusing to see those who had been so arrogant, calling us poor and lowly, actually taste the bitterness of true downfall. Chris and I are now living a graceful life in the high-rise we've been talking about. Wanting a child soon, but as it turns out, there's already a new life with us. A small child from a family we're close with pointed at my belly and said, "Hello, baby." This led me to get a checkup, and it turns out I'm 6 weeks pregnant. When I surprised Chris with the news, he cried tears of joy. We vowed to live even stronger as both a couple and soon-to-be parents.